Good evening and welcome to Story Hour. I'm tonight's host, Laura Blackwell. My delightful co-host, Daniel Marcus, started Story Hour over a year ago, beginning of quarantine.
Year and a half ago.
But we've known each other for a pretty long time because we have a local con called FogCon that we go to. And one thing I did want to alert you to is that since FogCons had to go virtual, like most of the cons, Daniel is going to be one of the featured readers coming this Sunday at a FogCon virtual reading. So he's going to drop that link for us in a little bit. And y'all can show up and hear him and Madeline Robbins, who we've had on before and is also wonderful. And there are going to be some short rapid reads as well. It will not be recorded. So we'll make sure you get the link. Oh, good. He put in the Eventbrite link. I'll put that in Facebook as well. So that said, that little announcement, welcome back to those of you who are returning, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. We have two first-time readers here. And as always, we have writers reading for their favorite nonprofits. Tonight's readers are Dave Ring and Anne Sheldon. If you are fortunate enough to help others during this time, please consider a donation to tonight's featured nonprofits, the Carl Brandon Society and Alley Cat Rescue. Dave Ring is reading for the Carl Brandon Society. The Carl Brandon Society envisions a world in which speculative fiction about complex and diverse cultures from writers of all backgrounds is used to understand the present and model possible futures, and where people of color are full citizens in the community of imagination and progress. Offering awards and scholarships, the Carl Brandon Society's mission is to increase racial and ethnic diversity in the production of and audience for speculative fiction. You can learn more at carlbrandon.org. Anne Sheldon is reading for Alley Cat Rescue. ACR works to save all cats, stray, abandoned, feral, and wild. Programs now include a low-cost spay-neuter clinic, international programs to help the African wildcat in South Africa, cat action teams to help people throughout the United States, and the May Spay Challenge. ACR runs a successful barn cat program which relocates feral cats to backyards, barns, warehouses, and shops to provide rodent control. And has a particular fondness for ACR because of a community cat called Victoria, who, once brought into ACR, was found to be Victor. Still a community cat, Victor is at least no longer tomcatting around the neighborhood. You can learn more about Alley Cat Rescue at saveacat.org. If you're here on Zoom, feel free to leave your camera on. It can be really nice to get that cozy eye contact during readings. And chime in on the text chat if you like. If you're joining us on Facebook, thank you. But we may not be seeing your messages in real time. And our first reader tonight is Dave Ring. Dave Ring is a queer writer of speculative fiction living in Washington, D.C. His short fiction has been featured in publications such as Fireside Fiction, Podcastle, and A Punk Rock Future. He is also the publisher and managing editor of Neon Hemlock Press and co-editor of Baffling Magazine. Find him online at dave-ring.com or at slickhop on Twitter. Dave, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It is our pleasure. What have you brought to read for us tonight?
I did this thing where I put a poll on Twitter, and as soon as a different story pulled into the lead, I realized what I actually wanted to read. So I'm going to be reading a story called A Phase Transition that I published in MYTHIC Magazine a couple of years ago.
Excellent. Please go ahead.
Right in. Okay. All right. There's a little bit of a horror overlap here, but I don't think there's any special content warnings that I need to share, actually. All right. A phase transition. The snow philosophy is a hexagonal lattice, cold forged by opportunity and environment, incapable of surviving contact with its inevitable conclusion. It isn't a school of thought that pretends to have grand designs on the biggest questions that we face about time or life itself or some other far reaching concept. It's a philosophy of temporal desire, of decisions. It's a way of looking at oneself in the moment and that moment's context and acknowledging the beauty of circumstance that propels one towards oblivion. Because all of us, I realize now, must make that inevitable progression, even me and my kin. If you'd asked me years ago if I'd ever thank the chore set for anything, I'd have called you a fool. I would have spat in the ground and called them vipers. And I was right, their ideas are insidious. At the time, they seemed juvenile, too pat. Honestly, the claim that each of us has only 3 reasons to hold back from the crushing light of the last dawn. 3 great works, only 3. Well, it seemed ludicrous. Why such a paltry number? What was the significance of 3? And even if I considered it to have a scrap of truth, it couldn't bother me at first because I thought I'd only ever completed 2. The first work should be obvious, even to you. It towers over the square, iconic and strange amidst its neighbors. A building that gestures to traditional structures from the capitals of its columns and balusters, but takes those gestures to a place of inspired whimsy, decorative post-Jacobean crenellations, striated alloys, and hyper-vernacular architecture. The work of 3 generations, they said. It took me 5 lifetimes from start to finish. We're not chosen by a person, Sophie tells me, to have this life that keeps unspooling in front of us, shimmering and new like a Mobius strip. It's something else, some other happenstance of the universe that makes us wake up young again one morning, lying in the sloughed off remains of our skin, which has turned paper thin and already on its way to becoming dust. It was bewildering, as you'd expect. I knew right away that I should keep my nature from others. Through feats of paperwork and administrative legerdemain, and in the eyes of the law, I became my own daughter so I could inherit my own estate. Several signatures and a hasty, ill-attended funeral later, I left the town of my first life to start my second. My second life is when I came into my own. A numbness that I barely noticed before then began to fade. And in my growing confidence and self-awareness, I learned a lot about myself. I remember vividly the motel room I used to stay in before the tower was habitable. The rug was an awful pattern of purple, orange, and gray that somehow managed to obscure all but the most heinous stains. The bathroom tiles were a putrid sort of moss color, and the full-length mirror opposite the bathroom door was particularly cruel. I had avoided mirrors for the majority of my first life, particularly towards the end, and I had told myself that I was a vain creature that didn't like to see the effects of time right across my skin. But one evening, after an interminable long day staring at plans and building orders, that inescapable mirror made me confront that at the heart of me, I'd never truly felt like a woman. Perhaps the self-realization was nascent before then, but that second life soon brought out in me a permissiveness to act as I willed. I cut off my hair, I bound my chest. I found myself studying the way I walked, determined to change my gait and the way I'd been socialized to carry myself. And if my voice still elicited an uncertain ma'am from strangers, I was just as often called sir by new drivers or by doormen. It was enough for things to feel right. Years passed. It was lonely at times, but I busied myself. I thought I'd been discreet about the effects of my will and estate and in the manner in which I picked up my affairs where I'd left off, but there was still much I didn't know about discretion. Isabella was the first to find me, and later, Sophie. Isabella presented herself to me at the first gala we held at the tower. Monsieur Indigoyen, I remember she called me, but it was just a joke then. I had lived another life and been reborn a second time, long enough ago that I was once again in my prime. She was a young-looking thing, all clavicles and piercing eyes. She'd worn a crystal-encrusted cocktail affair, just a touch shorter than convention would have recommended, and her dark hair was beaded and worked into hundreds of twists. We danced, though we'd known there'd be talk, and that dress sent scattershot rainbows bursting throughout the room whenever she spun herself across the floor. I didn't realize until later that she was one of my investors, or that she'd had me sussed long before we quick-stepped. You've been shepherding this project for a long time, she'd said. To be honest, I was surprised you got hold of the planning permissions from that beast Longheart. He was prepared to act reasonable after a fine vintage of cognac, I'd confessed, still dancing. Of course, she'd said, returning from a spin, he did always enjoy you to be. It was only then that I'd remembered that Longheart had been dead in the ground for decades. It was certainly a striking introduction. She'd confirmed a particular quality of her investment, and I was smitten. I was only at the beginning of recognizing how truly I enjoyed the attentions of women, so I pursued her in earnest. But it was a flame that by necessity guttered out quickly. I hadn't yet realized that Izzy was, in the vernacular, a hard ace. She'd already lived 5 lifetimes content in her own company. When I finally believed her, after a disgracefully long period of skepticism, we settled into a truly great friendship. When Sophie came into our lives, I'd crested another dawn, and Izzy was entering her next twilight. We'd taken to running by the river in the mornings before it got too warm. Izzy had always been the better athlete of the two of us, but youth had its virtues, and we were keeping a pace. There was a cafe we liked beside the poplar trees. I ordered a latte, Izzy the mint tea. And at the table beside us in a derby hat was a woman made up of sharp lines and nervous energy. It was Sophie. She had her satchel with her, the huge one with all the notebooks. She never stopped carrying it, even when I offered her the most expensive tablet that money could buy. She looked at us and asked if we were Beatrix and Degoyan and Isabella del Taupe. Beau, I'd corrected her without a beat, though it had been literally more than 100 years since I'd gone by Beatrix or even B. Izzy had already stood up from the table, prepared to tackle her or flee. I wasn't sure. Sophie had nodded, made a note in her paper. I've been admiring your work, she'd said. Izzy and I looked at each other. Then Izzy sat back down and called out for another pot of tea. Sophie was younger than both of us, but something about being what we were had taken to her, and the persistence with which she sought out answers was such that Izzy and I often spoke of how her work must have more to do with shepherding distracted artists like the two of us than the history she always purported to be writing. She interviewed both of us for hours with questions that we never really thought about, like how it felt when death's twilight came and what was in our thoughts when we entered the new dawn. I have some of her notes here, though I'm not sure what good they'll be. I think the biggest surprise from that first meeting was how little Izzy and I had examined our unusual states and instead simply stoked the fires of obsession and gotten to work. All this time, I continued construction on the tower. I'd installed both my new cannon suites as soon as the first wing was habitable and upgraded them as the project matured, as one might expect. The sculpture garden was built to please Isabella. Her room was on the ground floor with a separate door that looked like a service exit, tucked between 2 seemingly undulating buttresses. Sophie took her rooms beside my first suite on the first penthouse floor before I'd created the alloy innovations that allowed final construction on the minarets. Not that Sophie was often present in those rooms, but I knew I'd find her when she came into the capital. The rondelles were a gift to her, a nod to a time she was particularly fond of. I adored looking up at the minarets, especially with her beside me on those rare occasions I'd find her in my bed. Thin spindles gleaming with an opalescent gloss, darkened or translucent depending on the decisions of their residents. But seeing them also sparked a sadness in me after the chore set arrived. Even with Sophie breathing against my ear, her leg thrown over mine. So poisonous were the vipers that they disturbed even perfect moments like this. The tower was complete after 5 lifetimes of mine. Was its completion also hastening me towards a final twilight? Both Izzy and Sophie told me I was being maudlin, as if they'd forgotten when we all lost Marco a decade ago. But though I can still summon the heart of him when I go to hear his music, I miss him. I miss him deeply. Greatness came too readily to his fingers, to his compositions. Marco was only reborn twice before he saw his last dawn. It felt like the deaths of my youth when mortality loomed constantly. Marco, when I should have had so many more years of squabbling over his terrible parties and the constant parade of doe-eyed youths that he seduced and cast off and seduced again. So many piss-poor lagers and dank bars and clandestine meetings on the roof to smoke cigars where Sophie wouldn't catch the reek of us. If the tower was not enough for me and the snow philosophy had been trapped in ink and released via torrent, I had to be wary of how often I should see my other reason to live. You, dear Joseph. It was a revolution that brought your mother and I together. She chained herself to the wall in front of the tower. A young woman had been killed. The murderer kept saying he had a right to kill her because she'd lied to him, because she wasn't really a woman. I can still picture Carolina on that wall, long hair streaming down her back and fists raised to the sky, telling the crowds about that young woman's name and her life and what she would have done if she'd been allowed to live. I carry that woman's name in my marrow. Some leaders have a fire in them that cannot be denied, cannot be ignored. Carolina had that, and I was far from immune. When she and I laid together, we had no sense that we were creating a life. I'd been living as a man for decades, uterus notwithstanding, and we didn't think that she might still carry seed. I didn't anyway, but we conceived. It was a foolish thing, perhaps, to carry you to term. I could never explain to you what I was. I'd already promised secrecy to Sophie and Isabella, or then I couldn't. I'm telling you now. Carolina took well to motherhood as soon as you were born, and your gestation in me, rather than her, stopped making her feel like a liar. As much as I'd never really cared for gender, Carolina adored it, and to extremes. On my own, I'd once worn silks or pastels or even makeup, but there was something about Carolina that made me want to be more of a man. The pregnancy made that difficult, but ultimately easier for me to do what was necessary. It was a pity she couldn't make me want to be a father. It was an inconvenient time to die after having you. A false death had to come with a reason, and that meant scrutiny. It wasn't part of my usual cycle, but the trappings of age and the accompanying expectations were there to ease the hearts of those I left behind. Instead, I simply insulated myself from the world through wealth and technology until it had forgotten me enough that I could reemerge. Carolina wore black to my funeral and forever after that. Of course, you know. You might not know that she dressed you in black as well that day, a tiny black onesie, or that you cried throughout Amazing Grace, which was usually the best part of my funerals. This ceremony had a much more urgent tone than I preferred, and so many attendees. It was both vexing and gratifying, considering how circumspect I'd tried to be when it came to making friends. But my brilliance attracted admirers, and more than that, Carolina was well loved. Somehow you seemed as unconvinced of my architectural greatness now as you did during that funeral, which is more unnerving than you know. I knew you'd never want for anything. My will had made sure of that. And if there was anything the centuries had taught me at this point, it was the importance of a strong legal document. I know sometimes Carolina suspected things were not as they seemed. I'm not proud to say that at first I had her keystrokes logged and scanned regularly by a program that Sophie had written. I'm sure the coincidences at times grew daunting. Carolina had more than her fair share of conspiracy theories. They distressed me, so I confided in Izzy, who promptly made me transfer the codes to her, since she didn't think that I could be impartial if I learned that Carolina had discovered our true nature. Besides which, she said, the paranoia distracted me from my art. I tried to forget you and Carolina that day. I think I would have succeeded if it wasn't for a chance encounter we had years later, a coincidence utterly without artifice. You'd placed into one of the gifted programs that I funded through the corporation, and as part of a spot check, I caught sight of your face. Carolina's glossy hair, my cleft chin, and a fierce expression all your own. Your freckled tan seemed some sort of negotiation between my skin and Carolina's olive complexion. I couldn't pretend that I didn't know you were mine. When I pulled up your scores and saw your aptitudes, I fast-tracked you and kept tabs on you from afar. It was no accident you entered my classes 7 years later. Do you remember your first day in class with me? I looked for anything that could be recognition in you, but saw nothing. I still wore the same skin that had carried you for 9 months and 27 days, that had stretched and grown to feed you, that had borne you screaming into a cold winter night. Did Carolina not have photos on the walls? But you continued to delight at first. Classes were still pure whimsy then, playing with 3D models and cultivating authorial vision. It was only later, when you showed technical prowess but no innovation, that I grew disappointed. It was difficult for me to see you level out. I still gave you passing marks because I thought that perhaps you might dig up some hidden spark. Eventually, my teaching aide questioned me directly about the decision to keep you past the third semester when the other sub-talented students were sent home. She asked it without malice, as if there was some quality in you that I'd seen and she had overlooked. I snapped at her, defensive, but truth rose up in me like a swell, and I had to apologize. Then I had you struck from the roster. With that, I lost the ability to see you in person every day, but I still followed your path. I thought your college essays were lovely, especially the ones about Carolina. I grieved when none of the programs you sought were quite the fit you'd hoped. It was not that much of a stretch to found the Center for Architectural Sound in Structure. Oh, I think I see something in the look you're giving me, but know that I wanted you to thrive. I thought you knew, to be frank. I wasn't as circumspect as I should have been. And was it so wrong? I wanted my son to have a chance at greatness in one lifetime. I cannot undo it now, and please don't think that you didn't put your own mark in it. You did. I helped you. My plans were they're ultimately not that subtle. Sophie reminded me almost daily during our visits that our nature could not be groomed or bestowed. I believed in her in my head, but perhaps not in my heart. When your mother was dying, I nearly told her what I was and why I had left her. I passed you in the hospital the night I visited her. It was difficult not to greet you. Do you remember? I wore a gray duster and a terrible beige hat that Izzy claims gave me a dashing veneer. The snows came so early that year that everything was cold and smelled of wet wool. Even now, I associate that smell with her hospital room, a strange connection between all those softly beeping machines and damp merino. I can almost smell it now. When I got there, she recognized me, not as a sort of immortal or whatever I am, but as a ghost or an angel. She murmured both and would not hear otherwise. She hadn't talked of gods or God once while we'd been together, so it surprised me, but I suppose even stronger souls than hers have sought out such solace as their life waned. So, did you know I funded the statue of your mother in the East Square? And even sculpted it with my own hands. That pose is how I first saw her, one arm stretched towards the sky, as if she were about to call down thunderbolts, and the other in a death grip on that busted megaphone. I am not a sculptor. It is not a great work, but I made it with love. In the end, I didn't tell her. It broke my heart, but I couldn't take away her miraculous vision, her visit from the angels. It was petty of me, maybe, but I wanted to give her that since I'd taken away so much else. I'm here now because I can't bring myself to make the same mistake with you. My tower has been finished for 16 years now? I've taken such pride in seeing your name on the board of trustees these past few years. I hope it gave you some fraction of the joy I got from it. I wanted to love your children as much as I loved you, but it broke my heart when you chose your son over your work while he took the best years of your life. You won't hate me, I hope, when I say I wasn't displeased about the accident. It brought you back to yourself, no distractions. And for a while, as I've alluded, there were more of us here, a veritable colony, the Vipers themselves, Simone and Garrett and Abdoulaye in Lancaster, plus Marco and Sophie and Isabella. But where Marco, Sophie, Izzy, and myself had found some equilibrium, the chore set had a sort of gloom that was difficult to shake off if you spent too much time with them. I glossed over this with Marco earlier, but he'd grown closer to Lancaster than I would have liked, and it cost him. It cost all of us. Sophie had been so pleased with herself when she put together the dots, realized they were of our sort. She extended the olive branch, but it is my towers, so I was always meant to play the host. Lancaster had built the government in Shore from scratch, empowered it first through a beautiful coup, and later through a painstakingly precise tricameral legislature. Now it stands a shining monolith of communications and hope. Before that, he designed the first inverted pipe organ. And before that, the lucid sky framework that replaced Euclidean geometry and is part of the bedrock of my own designs for the tower. But then he was done, a guttering flame, and he'd come to us to flicker out. We figured it out eventually. He was one of us, yes, but he had no work. It was tragic, but we didn't realize how much so. We didn't realize he would take Marco with him. I always said that I didn't believe him or his dire portents. After all, what was so special about the number 3? He had no proof, only suppositions. Sophie and Izzy were no use discussing it. Sophie's work, her histories, were only the first she'd embarked upon, and Izzy's inquiries seemed boundless whenever she pushed up against the edge of it. So I scoffed as I completed my tower. Then again, after the many feverish tomes that I filled with the snow philosophy and its applications, the rituals of introspection and difference. It was a chance remark by a scientist called Hallett in a dry text that struck my fancy unexpectedly. A snowflake's final shape is a history lesson of how the thing grew, they said. That kernel of an idea became so much to me. This philosophy evolved from a feral creation that could take monstrous shape as it embodied its own history. I truly didn't expect for it to crystallize so sharply or so quickly. There's still a part of me that wonders if it will be of use in a time other than this one, or if it's so of itself that it can only shine briefly, but brightly, since by doing so, it would ultimately prove itself. This bores you, I think, but it is important. See, applied to myself, I could not ignore the discovery it brought me to, which was you. I couldn't deny it. You were my next work and my third. It wasn't unheard of for us to have concurrent projects, but it was rare enough that I didn't consider it possible, even as I invested so much energy into engineering your growth from afar. What could you be but that, I decided. It was as if I'd torn aside the thin curtain of denial. It's never been done, Sophie tells me over and over, but no one wrought a symphony that trained neurons to fire before Marco, and no one built a tower that defied possibility before me. Our kind was meant to defy limits, and if there was a way to instill potential, to transfer the essence of my kind, I would be the one to achieve it, and you might be such a candidate to attain it. Izzy's been overwrought and refused to see me these past few weeks, but if it works the way I think it will, you must go to her. You'll be weak at first, soft, she'll take you in. It's coming now, I think. When you've died a few times, you learn to recognize the signs. It's all here in Sophie's notes. Light blooming in one's retinas, breath starting to come with unexpected labor. The declining of your measurements, the fading of those persistent electronic background noises, they may alarm you, but know that when I felt the same all that time ago, I emerged whole with many lifetimes ahead of me. The alignments of our skins could not be more perfect. My preparations are well considered, I promise you. And I should say that the future speaks to no one but the present. If my work is true, you will greet the dawn anew. If it is false, well, then tomorrow I shall face those vipers in their nest. Joseph, I've sent away the nurses and the doctors. The glow coming through the windows, the coming dawn, so literal. It's almost too much like poetry. I'd like to hold you like we've never had the chance to before, but no, you're shaking. Perhaps I've not earned the right. I will stay here on this side of the line. I'm pulling the plug now. When the weariness comes, let it run through you. Let it burden your bones. Just when you feel like you might fall, welcome it. Fall into yourself. And in the moment of falling, perhaps you will rise. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. That was really beautiful.
Yeah,
Thanks. It feels a lot creepier saying it out loud. But
not creepy at all. It was beautiful.
It was lovely, really.
thanks.
Gosh.
You always need to take a breath in between the stories. At night, I read short stories almost every night, and I can never read more than one because stories just sort of have to soak in. And sometimes one story has as much power as an entire novel. But we are fortunate to have two writers reading stories tonight. So we're just going to take our breath and prepare to listen to Anne Sheldon.
Okay.
Anne Sheldon is a retired children's librarian living in Silver Spring, Maryland, with one cat and 3 generations of books. She has worked as a poet in the schools through the Maryland State Arts Council and has taught storytelling at the University of Maryland. Her work has appeared in Blackgate, Paradox, Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, and other small, but I mean, she's being modest, really prestigious magazines. Anne, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The story I'd like to read to you today, or this evening, is entitled Garden Apartments of the Brave. And it's in an anthology called Defying Gravity, put together by Richard Peabody, who's a writer in my area, both of fiction and prose. October 14th, 1981. Margaret had been on her balcony enjoying the unseasonably warm October weather with a glass of wine and an old rebound library book. Often she felt as if she'd been put down in the world of traffic and loud music by some cosmic mistake. The world of Jeremiah Rowland was as comfortable to her as an old shoe, though rather more hazardous. Yorktown, October 14th, 1781. Redoubt number 10 stands within 20 feet of the River York. Finally, to bring the matter of American independence to conclusion, it must be stormed. The color of the oak leaf here is not to be compared with that of old New England, but it is soothing to the spirit. Diaries of a Connecticut Schoolmaster, Jeremiah Rowland, 1817, page 49. Well, then she looked up from the yellowish page and saw a man with a gun. Well, a musket, really, probably a harmless antique, but dressed in the Continental uniform one saw so often on reenactors here in Yorktown, he seemed to be casing her neighbor's apartments. Though a librarian, she was accustomed to being mistaken, but here was a man with a gun. She ought to do something. She didn't want to. She had a program to plan on the Battle of Yorktown for a room full of Girl Scouts on the anniversary, and the 19th was only a few days away. The branch manager had directed her to discuss the siege, etc., but without any mention of violence. Patriotism was a fine thing, of course, but nobody likes violence. This seemed unreasonable. She wasn't likely to glorify bloodshed. She was a quiet soul who could hardly bear to watch professional sports. And rather than step on a spider she found indoors, would catch it in a juice glass, clap her hand over the top, and run out to the balcony to let it go. Just a moment. So in some ways, it had been a relief when Buck moved out, taking with him his widescreen TV and his racks of Super Bowl tapes. She missed his blue eyes and his laugh and the way he snuggled after sex. But she didn't miss the noise and the clutter and the smashing cars and bodies on the big screen. And she certainly had no wish to involve herself in any form of mayhem. But this man in a blue frock coat and a three-cornered hat was pausing deliberately at each ground floor window with a gun. At Patriot Meadows, clusters of apartments surrounded a grassy courtyard, a sort of village green in which one old oak tree had been preserved, a point of pride with the developer and a gesture to the Historical Society, which had objected to the apartments being built so close to the battlefield. The gunman stood now in front of a window from which a blue flicker and a vague roar emanated. It being so warm, only a window screen stood between him and the room with the TV. Calmly, he drew the musket up into firing position and paused. Then his shoulder jerked backwards. Margaret jumped up, knocking over her glass of wine. She ran back through the apartment to the hallway door and left it standing wide open as she careened down the stairs. What she remembered later, but didn't reflect on, as her bare feet slapped against the cold slate stairs, was that she had heard nothing. When she pushed open the front door and ran out onto the lawn, he was gone. She stopped, wondering what she would have done if he'd been there. Then she walked quickly over to the window through which he had shot the gun. There was no hole in the screen. There were no bodies on the floor. There was no television. She stood still, thoughtfully biting her thumb, as all her native uncertainty flooded back into her veins. She knew she had drunk less than 1 glass of wine. Feeling foolish and wishing that Buck were there, he was never fazed by awkward situations. She tentatively knocked on the window frame. A middle-aged man, his belly overhanging aquamarine running shorts, came out of another room. He held a huge bowl of popcorn in one hand and a just opened beer, frothing a little, in the other. It must have happened during a commercial, she thought, or he'd have been in the room. Yeah? Excuse me, but an armed man, or a reenactor of some kind, I think, was just peering in at your window with a gun. I just wondered if you're all right. He curled his lip with annoyed impatience. No, we're okay. Oh my God, the TV! Where's the TV? Cheryl, call the cops. Somebody swiped the TV. Well, actually, Margaret began, but she was talking to herself, for he'd already run into the other room, and now Cheryl was yelling. Actually, my best guess is that he didn't steal it, she said. She looked, there was no shattered glass or plastic on the apple green shag carpet. How could he possibly have gotten in and out so quickly with such a large object? Well, I think he killed it or beamed it up or down. She stood quietly on the lawn, still feeling foolish, while the frenzy continued inside. Too much frenzy, she thought, for a stolen TV, even a murdered TV. As long as no one was hurt, she would just as soon go back to her wine and her book. But now they were calling 911. The officer, when he came, asked her to describe the suspect. She'd been studying the cramped handwriting on the officer's gritty little notepad. Would he be offended if she offered to sharpen his pencil? She looked up, and there was her musketeer, leaning against the old oak. Unarmed now, but still in colonial dress, he gazed straight at her with a frank, pleasant smile. Perhaps 45, he was stocky but energetic looking, with a longish nose and large eyes. His dress, she noticed now, was not that of the famous men in the lithographs in the book, nor that of the middle class reenactors she saw so often. The blue of his uniform was faded, the white facings were badly frayed, and there was a large dark stain on his waistcoat just below his collarbone on the left. A protective feeling made her reluctant to point him out, but she began to describe him, all the while staring at him, even gesturing in his direction. The policeman and the man and his wife followed her gestures and looked where she was looking, but showed no sign they saw anyone or anything out of the ordinary. Conscious of the pleasant tang of wine still on her tongue, she worked out the different conclusions she could draw. Either she was drunk, or she was crazy, or the couple and the policeman were blind, or the soldier in the tricorner hat was invisible to everyone but herself. October 15th, 1781. We took the redoubt in a matter of minutes. We lost only 18 Continentals, 1 sergeant, 16 rank and file, and I grieve to put down Captain Whitegrave, who has but lately been my own schoolmaster. Ibid, page 52. The next night, she sat again after dinner on the balcony, drinking a little wine and carefully turning the brittle pages of the old journal. She heard something in the bushes and looked up. He stood farther away this time, but again he raised his musket toward the blue flicker of another living room. His shoulder jerked back and the blue flicker went out. She jumped up and stood still. She stood this way for several seconds, frowning with indecision. If Buck were here, she thought, but he wasn't. She quietly sat back down, took a sip of wine, and reopened the book. About 15 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to the same policeman and a gnarled old lady in a fuchsia sweatsuit. From time to time, Margaret had seen her walking a little poodle. Another TV's been stolen, said the officer, without raising his eyes from the pad. Right smack in the middle of Desperate Housewives, the old woman snarled, peering around the policeman at Margaret's apartment. One goddamn trip to the icebox and whammo, it's gone. What am I supposed to do for the rest of the night? Knit? Margaret conceded silently that it was impossible to imagine her knitting. Same thing happened last night, the cop reminded her, ignoring the senior citizen for the moment. You said you saw an armed intruder. Yes. Did you see anyone suspicious tonight? Well, he hadn't been suspicious. No, I'm sorry, I didn't. Well, aren't you going to search her apartment? The old woman snapped. I don't have a search warrant, ma'am, he commented wearily. Please, Margaret said, go right ahead. She would waive her Fourth Amendment rights until she really needed them. Her neighbor badgered the policeman into every room and every closet, and they both seemed to find the absence of any TV at all cause for suspicion. But the policeman left without fining or arresting her. By then it was dark outside. Margaret turned off the lights behind her in the living room and took the rest of her wine back out on the balcony. It was immediately what struck you at night, the blue shimmer from nearly every window, distracting the eye from moon and stars. Would all their TVs be stolen? If it was some kind of moral crusade, what about families that watched mostly public television? Then she saw him again. In the diffuse light of moon and stars and TVs, he looked more serious, the most serious person she'd met or seen in months. But he was dead. He must be dead. Died at the storming of Redoubt Number 10? Was that a captain's uniform he wore? Was this Captain Whitegrave, who'd given up school teaching to fight for independence? And now come back on the anniversary to shoot televisions? But he smiled his charming smile, and he bowed, sweeping off his tri-corner hat. He might be dead, but he certainly had lovely manners. He opened his mouth. Bread and circuses, miss, she heard in her mind, as if in answer to her unspoken question. Bread and circuses. Well, a New England schoolmaster would know about Juvenal and his critique of the rotting Roman Empire. Rome had been a brave young republic once too. Ah, she said, beer and football, etc. He nodded and smiled. She was amazed how slowly each busy day passed that week as she waited for evening and the rich, quiet minutes, sitting with his presence in the darkness. That is, after the police had come and gone. Each night, up through Saturday, one more TV disappeared. And each night, the unfortunate officer was a little more frustrated at his inability to solve the mystery. But the neighbors now were talking to each other in the evenings instead of sitting like statues in front of their private circuses. They were mad, for sure, to be the victims of theft or whatever it was, but it wasn't unpleasant to be at the center of a mystery. October 19th, 1781. Among us Continentals drawn up to receive the British surrender, there was all manner of raggle-taggle dress, but all of us are conquerors, and I believed our fallen comrades to be at peace this day. Ibid, page 61. Well, Margaret's talk on Saturday for the Girl Scouts went surprisingly well. She quoted Lafayette. In this business of storming redoubts with unloaded arms and fixed bayonets, the merit of the deed is in the soldiers who execute it. And one of the scouts asked through her gleaming braces, why did they have to fix the bayonets? Another 12-year-old with pierced ears and a skinned knee replied, they were too poor. All their bayonets were broken, but they won anyway. Margaret explained that fixing a bayonet meant attaching it to the muzzle of the gun, thus making it a different kind of weapon, and went on to talk about what these men had given up. The quiet life of a schoolmaster, for instance, to fight for what they believed in. And for the most part, she avoided a lengthy discussion of blood and gore. She came home pleased and a little tired, but eager to do a bit of house cleaning. She filled a brown bag with packages of cheese doodles and pork rinds that were still in her cupboard, and a few cans of Rolling Rock that were still in her fridge, and carried the bag out to her car. A quick trip to the grocery brought back several boxes of celestial seasonings with their promises of enlightenment. And now they perched on the shelf above the little kitchen window as they used to. She pulled a big carton of books out of the back hallway closet and returned her grandmother's leather-bound set of James Fenimore Cooper in alphabetical order by title to the table from which Buck's TV had routed it. Well, Margaret never saw Captain Whitegrave again, but each night he had appeared after the first, she had refilled her wine glass and left it on the balcony when she went to bed. When she found the empty glass each morning, she felt as pleased as a child on Christmas morning, whose offering of milk and cookies has disappeared from its place on the hearth. Thank you.
Well, that was delightful.
Oh, well, thank you.
I know that Zoom felt it necessary to tell me several times that I was muted since I was laughing hard enough that it noticed.
Yes. No, it was heartening to see you laughing. That was good.
Oh, good.
Oh, gosh.
Ah, Daniel, what an evening.
Yeah, seriously. Thank you both so much for coming and sharing your work.
Oh, you're so welcome. Oh my gosh.
And Dave, you know, I'm sorry that if Twitter is disappointed about which story you decided to read, but I was very happy.
I'm glad.
And you're welcome to come back and read about a lich anytime you like.
That's like story after dark, maybe. That one's a little.
And both of you are welcome to come back anytime. Just shout out.
Oh
Yeah.
gosh.
As long as we have content warnings, we're usually pretty okay.
Yeah.
But Yes, what a delightful pairing. Almost pretty much nothing in common between them, and yet they sit side by side very nicely.
Odd how that
Really.
seems to work out
Mhm.
consistently.
You know, pretty much every week, we don't plan who's reading with whom, and they don't plan what they're reading with each other. And you know, pretty much every week
Seems
it
to work.
works out fine.
Yeah.
And those other times there is collusion. So, you know, it always works. So next week is also going to be excellent. We have Gwendolyn Keist and Primi Mohammed. And you can keep up to date about upcoming authors at storyhour2020.com. We are currently booked almost through January of 2022.
Which is
amazing.
crazy.
It's amazing to me. And you can see any programs you may have missed on the Story Hour page on Facebook. If you're watching this after the recording, you're probably there already, and you can catch up almost all the way back to the beginning with us. So Dave, Anne, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us tonight. This has really been a lovely evening, really excellent stuff.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank you,
again.
Dave. That was great.
It's been our pleasure. Thank you to my co-host, Daniel, without whom we would have no Story Hour to
Thank you,
give
Daniel.
meaning to our Wednesdays.
Allow me to briefly shill my reading this Sunday with the FogCon Authors Read event. There's a link posted in the chat pod. So, and I'll post something on the Story Hour page as well.
Okay, great.
Come on down.
Thank you, all of you who've joined us, all of you who are watching later. Thank you for being part of Story Hour.
Thank you, Cliff.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.